So good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon, everyone that's joined us via Zoom. I want to thank you for joining us for our final artist talk. My name is Leah Rosenthal. I'm the artistic director at La Jolla Music Society. And I'm just so grateful that so many of us have joined us in the Atkinson room as well. Ideally, we would all have been together, but we just didn't want to lose the opportunity for our LJMS family to get to know all of you a bit more. I'm joined here by Gabriela Lena Frank, by Timothy Peterson, Christine Hedden, Akshaya Avril Tucker, and Michael Thomas Foumai. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. I mentioned this before we had guests in the room, but I was talking to Nick Benavides, who we heard last night following his performance, and I just said each piece felt like the composer had exposed a part of themselves, and all of the works illuminated warmth. And I just think it was a testament to the incredible gifts. But I also want to say that Gabriella, obviously this is something that that you saw in all of these young artists too, was this incredible sense of warmth and willingness to sort of give of themselves in their music. And so I would love to go around, if Gabriella, you might start and talk a little bit about your musical background and sort of whether there was this aha kind of moment where music sort of you knew was going to be a constant friend throughout your life.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having this, having all of us here. And I haven't seen a couple of these people in a while, so it's really nice to have an excuse to see everybody again. And you're right that each of the people that I bring to my small academy up in Northern California, called the Gabriela Lena Frank Creative Academy of Music. We're a small nonprofit that tries to partner with either emerging composers or composers kind of early in their career, now not so early anymore, as some of them have continued to mature, to keep assisting them artistically and professionally, but also to provide a community, because this can be a very isolating profession if you let it be. But what I realized was that since I'm literally holding this out of my house, it's literally all done in my home, who are the kind of people that I would invite into my home? Mm-hmm. And I tend to invite people that may write very different music than I do, but have a larger commonality there, which is, I think we're all storytellers. And I like to think of us as all being a witness to our life and to the human experience, for lack of a better word for it. So my own background is, I was born in the early 70s. And when I came of age in the 90s to study classical music, I was very much an unlikely candidate for somebody that would go on to have a vibrant career as a composer of symphonies and string quartets. This is what I literally do for my living. My mom is from South America. My father descended from Eastern European Jews. I'm also part Chinese, which you can't see in me at all, but you can see it in some of the faces of my cousins. And I grew up listening to música andina, música de Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, all these wonderful countries in Latin America that have a really strong highland culture. So I wanted to be able to bring it into my music, and I've dedicated my life to exploring all of that. And I think all of us in this room have that similar kind of mission, but it comes out in very different ways. So Christine and Akshaya were in the very first year of my academy when back in 2017, I kept it all very quiet. There was no website, but I just wanted to see if I could even do this, because I never saw myself as leading a nonprofit. It was not a personal goal of mine. So I remember Christine was a little less of a mystery, because you and I had met in Michigan. I was guesting there and I saw some of her music, and she'll tell you about it. And my interest went like this, just to see it. And we started talking about trying to capture this very performance rich vocabulary in Western notation, but she's not Peruvian. And she's in Ireland right now, and I've never been in Ireland, but we could hold this conversation. And Akshaya came my first year, heavily recommended by somebody who's local to Southern California, Rina Esmael, who explores her Indian heritage And she said, you gotta take this one. You gotta take this one. You got. So I said, I trust you. I trust you. I trust you. It's my home. It's my home. And she was wonderful. And in fact, the two of you got to know each other because I put them together in the same cycle, just thinking that they would be wonderful kindred spirits together. So maybe the two of you could talk a little bit about how you see yourself in your work.
Christine, you want to start?
Sure. Go ahead. We still going a little bit about background too?
Yeah, if you want to talk a little bit about sort of, yeah, we can go all the way back. We can go left, right, zigzag. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah, so like Gabriella mentioned, I'm in Ireland right now. The sun literally just went down, so the light kind of changed on my Zoom. Yeah, I'm from Connecticut, and I started writing before I played any instrument. I kind of would make up these little songs. I grew up with Lord of the Rings as my bedtime story, and I started reading ahead, and then one day my dad got really sad when he realized that I was able to read ahead and he wouldn't be able to read to us anymore. So instead, I took the poems that are throughout the book and I would make little songs to memorize them and just take them out in my play during the day. I grew up on my grandparents' Christmas tree farm, and so all over the Christmas tree farm singing these little songs. But when I did start playing an instrument, I picked up the viola and the fiddle and started playing New England traditional music, which draws melodies from a whole bunch of different places, from Scotland and Ireland and Quebec. And I always found the Irish melodies to be my favorite. So I ran after Irish music and got really involved in that. So now, in addition to writing classical music, I perform a lot of Irish traditional music as well, and that's what brings me over here. And that's what brings my two worlds together, like being able to translate what I play and what I hear in Irish traditional music is really at the core of what I've tried to do in my classical music.
And you could hear that. Yeah. And you could hear that beautifully last night. Your piece ended the program, and it was just that nuance, and then it was something that just everyone sort of left with this feeling of joy, and so it was a lovely ending to the evening.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Akshaya?
Sure. Yeah. I think actually that what Christine just said about being able to play what you hear and play from that like synthesis of what the different parts that make you up, that's like very relevant to me as well. I actually grew up there also in the same part of the world in Western Massachusetts. And I started off playing cello and studying classical Indian Odissi dance, which is a classical Indian dance style from the eastern coast of India. And just studying that in Massachusetts. And I studied for about 20 years, and I performed a lot, both, like chamber music on cello and then classical Indian dance at various stages. We took toward Japan at one point. We were very, very serious about it. So my music is kind of taking from, the music that I'd listen to while dancing, which is, heavily influenced by Hindustani music of North India. So trying to create some kind of a hybrid was an early goal of mine, to be able to, dance to something that felt right. And it didn't feel totally right to dance to just Western classical music. And I wanted to be able to express myself and not just write in imitation of Indian music. And so I think you'll hear that in my piece tomorrow, trying to find some sort of hybrid that comes out of me just as a thing that is like in my head. It naturally exists somewhere in that space between. And so that's something that I've been trying to explore for some time, and it kind of goes across the spectrum from one thing to the other. And I do, exploring very personal topics are also quite important to me, whether it's, exploring, very like personal experiences, my piece tomorrow is about my grandfather and the experience of being with him at the very end of his life. And he and I used to play music together a lot, so it was very personal. And yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what are those next topics, those next personal things that will carry me through to the next projects that I'm working on.
Great. Timothy, do you want to go next? Talk a little bit about your influences.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So, like Gabriella mentioned, I've always been really interested in storytelling, and whether through instrumental pieces or vocal pieces. I really enjoy working with living poets, and my piece I was programmed on this series was an example of that, a collaboration with a wonderful poet, Catherine Pond, who I met as a graduate student at USC. And I've also just always been captivated by like the mystery and magic of music, and those aha moments that I think a lot of musicians experience growing up, where I'm a pianist, and so my first piano teacher, I would be playing a Chopin nocturne, and there would just be a particularly beautiful chord, and we would just look at each other and smile and not really talk about it yet. That came with the theory classes later in school, I guess. But so I've always just been wanting to share that experience of awe and mystery with my audiences, and that also led me to kind of explore non-Western traditions while pursuing my undergraduate at Michigan. It was a really supportive environment that offered grants to go abroad. So I went to Morocco and Cuba and southern India to study local traditions that don't necessarily surface so much in my own music, but they each just had certain approaches to rhythm and harmony and performance that intrigued me and that I wanted to learn more about. And Michigan was also where I crossed paths with Gabriella, and that led me to participate in GLF Cam, which has had an enormous impact on me and my artistic life.
I was looking at bios earlier, and someone else went to Michigan in this group, right? Okay, Christine. Oh, and Michael. So what is it? Well, let me talk to you, Michael. I have a follow-up question because now I'm curious. But Michael, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, hello everyone. And I was born in Hawaii. That's where I am right now. And I was always really fascinated with watching movies, and I still am today. I think I would collect a lot of VHS tapes of movies, and just I was just so drawn to the music, and more so when I could recall all the stories without actually having to see the pictures. And so that's something that I wanted to do when I was young, was to be a filmmaker. But I found myself really liking music, and my family is pretty musical. My mom was a pianist and an organist. My sister was a pianist and a clarinetist. My dad was a guitarist, and well, my brother was a football player. So he tried to pull me out of that.
You always have to have one person. I'm the odd man out of my family. They're all doctors, and I was like, nope, not me. When I'm going to work in the arts.
Exactly. For me, though, I was not very much of an athletic person. So I went the musical route, took some piano lessons, and I didn't quite enjoy it that much. I had nerves when I had to give my first recital. And so I was thinking, maybe this is not for me. But my sister brought me to a band room for our high school and had me try out all the wind instruments. And I said, okay, this could be something I could do. And so I signed up for band, but apparently it was put into orchestra instead. And I picked up the violin because I had saw it on television, people performing these wild pieces, and it sounded like they're, again, performing magic on stage. So, okay, let's see what that's like. And I kind of just stuck with it, and started composing at the same time, just as a hobby, creating these kind of tone poems, like music for dinosaurs and so forth. And I thought it was just a hobby. I really enjoyed performing. And so my senior year in high school, I was writing in secret a an orchestra piece, and that was my first piece. It was an orchestra piece, and there was a reading session. I asked my my orchestra director, I have a piece. Could we perform it? I said, well, let's read it first. And he asked me to conduct it, and I think that was like the life-changing moment where there's some kind of magic that happens when you hear your music for the first time, like tasting a dish or you've seen in a magazine for the first time. And there's no going back. And so, a lot of my music at that point was very cinematic, and it's still very cinematic in terms of the storytelling. And so I went to school for that, stayed at home to go for my undergraduate degree, and then later went to Michigan to pursue my graduate degrees in composition. And interesting thing is that when I was at that age, I actually wanted nothing to do with home. I wanted to explore everything elsewhere in the world. So my music reflected that. And when I got to Michigan near the end of my time there, I would always have questions when we got together with other composers, even teachers, asked me, they're always so curious, like, oh, I hear you're from Hawaii. What's it like there? What's the history? How did it become a state? And, I have kind of just, I don't know. And I felt really ashamed. And so at that point, it was a kind of a turning point for me, is that I should probably start looking at where I'm from, and having that in my music. My music since then has had a strong Hawaii influence. And that is one is the reasons, because it's for me to be able to learn about my home culture and to answer those questions when I'm presented with the questions for them. And when I've studied more about Hawaiian culture, I noticed that ancient Hawaiians were amazingly versatile. For thousands of years, they were isolated from the Western outside world. And so there's this idea of being sustainable. And that has actually grown into now kind of a new focus of my music, joining Hawaiian culture with this music that explores climate change. And so that's where I am now, and that kind of journey that I've taken.
Well, thank you for sharing. That was beautiful. And it looks like we have another guest that just joined us, Nicolas Benavides. Hi, I know we were just asking a little bit, people tell us a little bit about their background, and this idea of home that Michael just discussed was really the source of your piece last night about New Mexico and family and the generations of people that were there. And if you can talk a little bit about your musical influence and also about how it led to that work last night, which was just gorgeous. And we chatted briefly after, and I told you, it just was so moved. If you wouldn't mind just sharing a few words with us.
Yes, hello everybody. Sorry for my tardiness. I was at a new faculty orientation for a new job, so it was really exciting. It's just been a great morning and afternoon. And sorry, and it's so great to see everybody here. I love everybody here. I usually do this after Michael Thomas Foumai talks, which is I just want to copy paste everything he said. And just put New Mexico in for Hawaii, because he really said it perfectly. And I briefly said the same thing last night. I mean, I'm from New Mexico. I went off to school, and in school you don't learn much about where you're from. You learn to be an artist as part of a larger structure and institution and community, which makes sense. Institutions can't teach you who you are individually in a way. And later in life, I realized that I wanted to write about myself, and I was feeling my hands were tied because I felt like I didn't know enough about myself. I wasn't an expert in my own culture. And then through meeting people like Gabriella, I really learned that you don't need to be an expert to be a learner. If anything, those things sometimes are on opposite sides of the spectrum, and being a learner can be very exciting. And so these days, not every piece, but most pieces I treat as opportunities to learn about the history of New Mexico, my own personal family history, which has inspired many works. And I go in fully honest. I don't know everything as I begin the piece, and I don't know everything when I finish it, but I know a little bit more when I do, through writing, through listening, through reading. And my string quartet, El Quartet Caminos, kind of encapsulates that notion, where I set out with an idea of what the piece was about, and I learned so much more. And I can't put it all in the piece, but I can put a little bit of it in there, and that's enough for me. It excites me. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. And Gabriella, and this is for everyone. And I know sometimes it's hard when there's so many of you to be the one to chime in, but feel free. You know, I'm curious. The writing that a lot of the writing we heard last night is in sort of the traditional Western style of the format, and yet so many of you are incorporating so many of these different musical influences. Was it to sort of break that mold, or what was it that inspires you still to sort of learn in the classical tradition with all of these other influences that you add? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think classical music for many of us was the portal into becoming a sonic artist. The structure of classical music is so developed, where you have major conservatories and a lot of money and a lot of people that are trained. If the opportunity had presented itself to me when I was younger to study Andean music of Peru, I would have done that.
Mhm.
And I almost became a jazz musician, but some of my jazzers are like, no, because I got into music through improvising first. I could barely read or write when I went to college. I was faking it. And I always had a very good ears when I was learning piano music with my piano teacher, even violin for a while. I would just sort of listen, not perfect pitch, so I was just kind of listen and figure it out. And if I got nervous in a performance, if it was solo piano, I would just make it up. I'll get myself out of there and make up something that sounded Chopin-y, and then find my way out. And you would never know, because even if my heart was going through my chest, I was cool as a cucumber on the outside. I just had this survivalist mentality. And I remember thinking I was going to go into a jazz band, but the jazz band director was not that interested in women, and he didn't want a pianist. He wanted to keep it very mobile, just on the road. And I decided I'm going to go into classical. There's this institution called the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, which I had never heard of, growing up in Berkeley. I mean, I was really in my own world. And I remember right before my senior year in high school, going there, and I was blown away. I was blown away by seeing prodigies, and I was blown away by seeing a piano in every room, and I was blown away that there were textbooks instead of horrible algebra and chemistry. It was like music theory, and it was just amazing. And I noticed right away that there wasn't anybody that looked like me. I noticed that right away. And I remember I made that decision like overnight. This is what I'm going to do. And it just felt right. And I was scholastically a high achiever. Well, I was getting good enough grades and so many different topics. I probably could have gone in a lot of different directions. I was likely headed to law school, believe it or not. I was studying Russian at the time, and I was getting pretty good at it. At Berkeley High School, we had Russian teachers, and I thought, and this was 1989, so the wall had come down, and there was Gorbachev and Perestroika. I mean, this was my political awakening. And instead, I discovered melody. I discovered Western notation. And I also knew that I love South American music. So I had no choice but to go in thinking of this as an engine that I needed to figure out how I was going to use it. And I learned the rhetoric, I learned the culture, I learned the mores of classical music. I actually really enjoyed it as well. I learned how to present the score. I learned what's idiomatic for Western violin. And at some point during my grad studies is when I really started making concerted efforts. And I have to go through that feeling of, am I authentically Peruvian enough? I haven't been to Peru, but I heard the music. I grew up eating the food. I hear Indian sometimes in my household, or my mom still can speak some. And I started to learn over many years that culture is not just something you inherit. It's also an act, like what Nick was saying, is an act. And it's also not meant to be this border. It's supposed to be a portal. You're supposed to want to go explore all the Mexican restaurants in the area and see which ones are like Oaxaca style and Jalisco style. And it's supposed to be an invitation, but it has to be authenticity to it as well. And that depends on the kind of commitment you have. And so I'm committed to taking classical music and opening it up, making it more mestizo like me. And I think that my academy has benefited so much from people looking at classical music, loving its mores, but expecting classical music to love us back too, that this is a two-way street and we can participate in a conversation about how we're going to tell our stories in this world. I would be having the same conversation if I went into jazz, and I'd be having the same perspective if I went into South American folkloric music, just from a different angle. We're trying to get to this point in the middle, I think, where artists are truly global citizens, as you were saying earlier. If we think that way, then we're naturally, the byproduct of that is that we are witnesses, and we're encoding what we're witnessing into our craft, into our music for receiving a network of performers, as well as listeners and people interested in being part of the journey.
Does anyone want to add sort of their own experience? I see Nick. He looks like he wants to add.
Oh, I joined late. I just love stealing everything that everybody says before me. Basically, it's kind of my MO. Maybe that's what my art is too. I don't know, but, which isn't a terrible thing actually.
No, it's the highest form of flattery.
I think I just only have something small to add, and I want to hear from everybody else, which is I'm someone who grew up I grew up playing rancheras and corridos and Southwestern music. That was my primary music. And I did read because I played in the jazz ensembles, and I was determined to be a jazz saxophone major in undergrad. Before my parents said no, said you won't make no money. So I said, I'll be a classical composer instead, which was not much of a better option. But I didn't know anything about classical music, zero. Like I couldn't tell you the difference between Beethoven and Mozart when I was 18. I played music every day for hours in a variety of bands. I sung in the musicals. I was very active. But I just didn't have that in my culture at all. And so when I learned about the formal study of music, there really wasn't a choice, like Gabriella said. It was the choice for me. I was thrilled by it. I loved it. I went in and I loved my theory classes. I immediately took to it. I dove in. I was behind and I was hungry to catch up. But when it came to that sort of accelerated track of study, that was the primary option. And that was the skill set that I learned. And now I think I'm pretty okay at it. I've spent years doing this, but it was hard fought. It was really difficult to tell my parents who don't understand anything about this industry or field, or my family, like, I'm going to go to the opera, and they'll be like, what does that mean? You're just going to attend? Can you write an opera? How does that even work? And they've luckily been amazing. They now go to concerts with me, and they know when I talk about certain phrases and solfege, they know what these things mean. And it's really, this is all to say, we all have such varied backgrounds, and some people aren't born into it. Some of us discover it later in life. And it's really nice to be valued and validated in the field when I didn't have access to it early on.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to share? No? No awkward Zoom silence. Well, I'm curious. I've been working specifically in sort of the chamber music realm for 14 years now, and I've noticed a shift in the composers that people are commissioning. And I'm just curious if you felt recently there seems to be a more openness to not such sort of granitic and atonal music, and really sort of a shift in people wanting to see different aspects of new music where there's much more variety, and whether you feel like that's opened some more doors, because it was always a very specific sense of this is new music. And Gabriella, I wonder if you sort of faced some of those challenges too when you first sort of came on, that this is the way it's supposed to sound, and that part, if it's influences from other cultures, that's great, but this is the trajectory that new music is going in, and sort of the obstacles any of you have faced at that.
Yeah, it's so interesting getting this question now, because to me it seems super obvious that we moved out of sort of the atonal you're talking about, serialism, post-serialism time, which was, for those of you that may not know, it was a belief that there were no wrong notes. In other words, like instead of being like C major and D major, all the notes are democratic, so we use them all. And it can be very challenging to work with that. It's can lead to a surprisingly gray and colorless sort of sound when you don't have like a sense of da da dee da dun, and it's just the right note. It just set up. So that went and pervaded other aspects of rhythm, and it got very complex and cerebral, and it was hard to find musicians, performers that could even play some of this music. And this style really looked down on storytelling,
Yep.
Or being a witness to the world, or being inspired by movies or non-Western music. I mean, it was very, very exclusive. It was a very exclusive club, but it was just very powerful for many decades. I'm going to say like 40, really 40s, maybe. Then around the 70s, you started getting, people starting to invest in lyricism again, but it was just slow movement. I think I caught the very tail end of hardcore surrealism, and there are pockets of it. And the funny thing is that as a pianist, I actually like to play some of that stuff. It was so hard. It was like playing a computer game, like an obstacle course. So then my joy would come out, and I would be disappointed when sometimes people didn't like, what they were hearing. It's like, what? Let me play for you again. No, subjective, do it again. So but to see it from the inside, I said, okay, there's something here, but maybe I need something a bit more immediate. And I don't know what the answer is. I'm just going to go home. I'm just going to go to myself. And I think then as my career began to move in the early 2000s, I graduated in 2001 with my doctorate. So I was in training all through the 90s, just to kind of give you a sense of the cultural eras that I came of age, in which there were very few women, very few people of color. The attrition rate was really high for those that I did go to school with. In the early 2000s through 2008, 10, Latinos made a really big jump in the US economically and politically. They were often credited as helping Obama get elected in 2008. And I saw some interest come my way. And I thought I was not going to have a major career. I mean, I was going to Peru to study music. Nobody goes to Peru for classical music. Everybody goes to like Paris and Vienna and Austria, And so I made up my mind that I would get a job somewhere at a small liberal arts college, no music school would ever look at me. And I was just going to write my little string quartets and for the players that I went to school with that were amazing players. The kind of players that La Jolla books, those were the kind of players that I was playing chamber music with. I felt like I had my network and I didn't need to have a major career. I just needed to make money. And then the opposite started to happen. And I think I was reflecting some of the cultural interest coming towards Latinos. Then I've seen waves of interest only to recede, or some problematic things like programming one person of color, and then that organization has absolution for, we're good for about 3 seasons now. Let's just go back to do what we do.
Right.
And I realized that sometimes I was that instrument and I did not want to be. So it was, when I talk to other people about my age or so that are women or people of color, we all noticed that. And it was a really hard thing for us to navigate. So now we're seeing a new wave. And I think this one's different. We'll see. There are a lot of disturbing things that are going on in the world right now. We'll see. But just the reconciliation with an exclusionary past has been so forefront when I talk with major presenters, or I talk with people that are leading orchestras, and they're coming to me. My tiny little academy just really rose very quickly, and we're not that old. We're about the same age as an undergraduate degree. We're about 4 years old. But I think it's because I get people like these in this Zoom room that are already doing great work. We give them just a little bit more momentum. They know they have community with us. But we get approached because people are looking for voices. They're looking for voices. I'm so glad to putting that energy in. And when you gave us this kind of platform, my first thought was, how about my Academy composers? And you looked at them and you said, yes. And it really, it's hard to deny how vibrant the future looks. And so I think this wave, I don't know, how do you guys feel? I mean, how we move from sort of the past with this really strong dictating of what's in, what's not, I know we're jumping on serialism, but there are other things, other styles and other vistas also. But how do you feel about the world opening up to your voices?
Mhm. Well, as you think about that, because I know you all have a lot more to say. I feel it. I think when you were saying, is it here to stay too? I think administratively, it's changed too. There's a holistic approach that arts organizations from the top down, from board leadership to working with agents to people represented throughout organizations, that it's not just the token program or the token composer to come and say, oh, now, oh, look, we're diverse. Everyone really is taking a step back and exploring what they need to learn, what we need to do, and sort of integrating that throughout just all of our common practices. So I do think in that way, it's here to stay, that it's just going to become who we are as organizations moving forward, from a non-composer aspect. I do believe that. Timothy, you haven't said much. Why don't you chime in?
Yeah, I think just from conversations with my peers, we're starting to question certain conventions that were kind of instilled in us, like writing an orchestra piece being a make or break thing in your career. Like, why? Why do I have to live in the orchestral world if I much prefer chamber music and writing for voice? Like, who gets to make those decisions for my career? It should be me, right? So I think there's that level of excitement, which is really inspiring to be around. I know for me, like sometimes I get the question, like, what is, you say you're a classical composer. I don't even know if I say I just say I'm a composer, but people maybe go on my website and then think I'm classical. And so the only thing, my response to that question is like, what is classical music to you, is generally just based on instrumentation for me, which is maybe a nerdy specific thing, but like, I just love the instruments that are traditionally in an orchestra, but the sounds that they can make, I mean, the sky's the limit. So I just love writing for this particular family of instruments, and I personally like writing music down. I think it's really fun, and I just really enjoy the kind of visual art aspect of making a really pretty clean score, and the kind of magic of being able to transmit sounds through that visual medium to a stranger. It's just very cool to me. But stylistically, I think things are really starting to open up. And the more that people are invited into classical music and feel represented in classical music, the more they'll feel comfortable, I think, bringing in music that they grew up listening to. And that will only continue to enrich the sonic palette that we're hearing in venues like La Jolla's and all around the world, hopefully.
Akshaya or Christine, do you have anything you want to add?
You can go first this time if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the number, you know, I mean, as composers, we spend some time just like sending our scores out to random ensembles and random people. And I think like the number of ensembles who would say like, no, we don't want to play your piece because it's too pretty. Like, I think that number is small. It's a pretty small number. And that feels really encouraging, because it seems like there's more, there are more people who are trained to be able to play like many different styles, but maybe they don't specialize in the most crunchy, angular, dissonant music, and they would be interested in playing more, you know, styles that, you know, many of us in this room would write. So that's really encouraging.
Christine?
Yeah, I actually trying to, how do I say my thoughts, gather them together. Yeah, I think it's definitely opening up. I think just like any movement, there's still, you know, it gets better and better, but there's still sometimes moments that are tough, you know, sending our scores out. So, you know, in the last 5 years, I've still gotten some comments back that just really look at the music as very simpleton. And I think part of the reason I keep classical music in what I do is part of what got me into it, is that there can be misunderstandings between these worlds, and trying to weave the worlds together in our music is a way to communicate to both worlds you're in, and so that they both can hear something in it. And so this bringing together, I think, is really important in a way to keep the opening up and to keep the communication flowing and the learning happening.
I mean, you're all cultural ambassadors in that sense. I mean, Nicolas, when you were talking about how your parents had never experienced this music, and then you brought that to their lives and they fell in love with it, and just how when you could have two worlds and it's just dialogue, it's dialogue through music that just changes how, you know, people relate and feel towards one another. I mean, it's such a global statement because it applies to everything. But Christine, I think it's really beautiful what you said, and something that can relate on so many levels. And if we lived our lives with being open to sort of blend, I think we'd all be in a happier place. Yes.
You know, one of the things that can be very challenging for people, perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of opening up, as you were saying, is that if you're going to open up, you got to get more skill sets. And so a score that looks simple, Christine, you were talking about that, your music's actually hard to play. And the detail that you have for the color when you're doing scoratura, which I've seen before, the turns of phrases that Western notation can't encapsulate. And we're in a field where perfection is the norm. It's why we have to have nerves of steel in order to do what we do. So it's, as Nick was saying, to be in a position of constantly learning means that you have to admit there's something you don't know. And so if you pick up Correcaminos, or you pick up Breathing Sunlight, and you pick up stellar cartography, there are going to be aspects that you haven't seen before. And I think one of the beauties of some of these past mediums that were so strict, like serialism and some others, was that you could predict its outcome as you were composing. And anything less that outcome, because it's all on the page, meant that something was off in the physical body, the comportment of the performer. Whereas when you're opening up, there's a more collaborative relationship between the composer and the performer. And that's addictive. It's really, really hard to, that's why I wanted to be there in person, but I missed that energy so much, that give and take. Well, yeah, let's try it this way. I never thought of that. Let's try it this way. You guys are great. Can you just do some more? I mean, and just to keep revisiting and finding more in a piece. It's so addictive. It's so wonderful. And then to be able to be vulnerable, to actually be able to say, I don't know. Can you play it for me a few different ways? Whereas serialism, there was no I don't know, and other mediums. So when you open up the world, and it becomes very, very exciting, but also kind of perilous, kind of scary. And I should also say, just because I'm a disabled woman of color, when I started the Academy, I couldn't instantly command a diverse cohort of composers, because I have to go out and find them too. This is a challenge for all of us. This is for all of us. I think it's an important mission. And when you present a concert, by all reports, I'm hearing that last night was stunning. People come out inspired. They come out hopeful, and they feel like it's worth the effort. That could be one of the best things, most transformative things that we can do. You see these composers writing for performers who are going to bat for their composer. They're going for the money note. They're going for the high stuff. They're expanding their skill sets. They dialogue. I mean, it's just to see it play out in real time on wood and gut, with breath, with their bodies, with all that training, the obvious camaraderie on the stage. That's what inspires social change, artistic change. It's why we do what we do, and it's why we need to tell the stories that we tell.
Well, yes, well said. And I'm so grateful that all of you spent time with us today. And we're coming close to the end already. And I was going to see if anyone in the room had any questions they wanted to ask. Yes.
Can you talk about the collaborative process within the Academy and how
composers work together?
Sure. They want to know, can you talk a little bit about the collaborative process in the Creative Academy and how the composers work together when they're there?
Maybe I'll step out of this one. You guys talk about that. You went through it. I just observed.
Michael, you want to talk?
Sure.
Well, Michael, you worked with Joshua Roman, who
He's here right now.
they know, yeah.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah,
And Joshua premiered that piece with Johnny Gandelsman.
that's right, yeah. I'd written the piece without any kind of collaboration with the performer. And so the first time, I guess, is when we are in the room together is when we get the feedback. And I think one of the things is just they run through the piece and, they'll have suggestions. I think first about is it basically written well for the instrument? Is there anything that kind of feels awkward? And they're asking me questions as well. Is this what you want here? I mean, what's the idea here? Can you paint us a picture for what this music is supposed to be? I remember vividly remembering that there was a section in Stellar Cartography where some of what I think Johnny asked was, is this dance like, or is this like a car chase or something like that? And those things I think for me were. I'm certainly thinking about those kinds of images, but it didn't occur to me to actually put those in kind of adjectives into the score. And those were very helpful to them to kind of shape and phrase, and also to kind of save moments in the piece for when it really matters, when they need that kind of energy. And so, and then we have a whole bunch of other composers in the room as well. And so everyone is contributing things, suggestions. As I know, Gabby, you had said that this would sound really great if it was just an octave higher to kind of create the balance, because for the most part, it's kind of stays within this kind of range. And so it's really great to get those extra ears. Because, as I think I get this all the time where I'm so invested, and I'm sure this is true for many composers, living with a piece for so long that it's hard to have fresh ears and to see what can be improved.
Michael, what I remember also, I think of the entire 4 years, your piece came in to that initial reading. So they get a reading of an early work, and now we've developed the reading component even more since the first year. Now they get multiple readings. But the way it was in year 1, they come in with part of the music done and they give reading, and then they get a few months to finish it. Michael's piece was the closest to the finish line of more than 70 composers that have come through the Academy. So in that reading, we got to the nitty gritty on interpretation. So they were looking for inspiration, because those two guys can play anything, but they were like, okay, now let's get to beyond just being a machine. Is this a chase? And we could do the stuff like, you know what, these guys can play anything. Let's just knock it up an octave. They can do it, trust me. And I just want you to hear that. This is where we can ask for that. So the difference between a reading and a rehearsal is being able to play and ask for that. Performers don't have to come in with the music completely polished. Usually everybody's got their part down. But I remember in the same group, we also had Christine and Akshaya. All 3 of them were in the same group, and they all had 3 very different readings. So Akshaya's was really interesting because Breathing Sunlight came in. I remember basically all the ideas were there, but not fleshed out completely, and maybe a little compressed. And I remember some things went by a little too quick, and I said, let's just sit in that moment. So we composers, we tend to like compress everything in our brain. And it's like making broth. We just boil it down into the little nugget that you just throw in water. Once you put it in the water, then it turns into what it is. So it comes out compressed. I'm like, let's just open it up some, And so when you worked on it, I remember you didn't just like repeat. That's one way of making something longer. You develop the ideas and maybe I think also hearing it come to life, right? Akshaya, the virtuosity of Joshua and Johnny also did something. You want to talk a little bit about that? Like, how did you take that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the other part of this that was really influential to me was that you told me that it was okay to have the piece out of order, because I was stressed about trying to, make the start at the start and then the middle and then the end. But I had a bunch of just blocks, and I didn't know where they went. And so to have that permission to just have a bunch of excerpts of, maybe it's like a chapter over here, a chapter over there, and I'll figure out where they go later. That was really, really important. I think, just extremely virtuosic performers, but to know where the amount of detail, like where the intricacy really has an impact. I think it's very easy for me to make things even more intricate than it has to be. And so I think to hear that live was really important, because they could show me like, oh, this like shimmering detail right here, this is really giving the effect that I want, not just extra detail for the sake of having more detail there. And so I think that was the biggest thing, was being able to have everybody in the room tell me like, oh, the thing that you want there, this is how we get there. And to have that extra feedback, like, this is what I want. Is it coming through? Yes or no? Or maybe let's just adjust these few things, and bring it to life in that way. That was really, really helpful.
And you have to imagine also the feedback is from people like what you see here. Nice people, kind people, that aren't going to undersell or oversell. Like, they're just going to give it to you straight about things, but also from a place of how to make this more Akshaya, how to make it more Christine, more Timmy, more Nick, more Michael, and it's hard. It's like a bunch of writers getting together in a creative workshop. Is it like a really good workshop, or are they just tearing each other down?
Right.
And composers can do the same thing.
Right.
And even performers can be that way. So a lot of what the Academy tries to do is to foster that environment. For some composers, it's like a shock that the environment could be friendly like that. And then is to give skills on how to talk to performer lingo, skills on what's going through their brain when they're looking at our score for the first time, how to capitalize on what they've got, because sometimes we overlook a lot of it. So an important part of this week too is not just our readings, like all about us, is then we do a community concert in this tiny town of Boonville. And in the community concert, performers can play whatever they want. That's when you really see them shine. And they're playing the rep, they're not just great little bits and pieces, right? They're actually they're really singing and they're doing what they do, right? And then you realize, oh my God, I'm tapping about 5% of their gifts. And that's a huge part of this whole experience, is how to write for all of that performer, realizing that we're limiting the piece, not necessarily the performer. And yet we take feedback. And so you can just tell, right? When performers get your score, they complain about it for a few minutes, right? And then something draws them in and they start woodshedding, because that's what performers do, is that it becomes inevitable when there is a truth to the music. It's pristine, it's been worked with somebody, there's a voice, there's a story. They want to tell this story. They want to be the ones to get on stage, everybody listen, and to be that agent. And that's our job, is to bring those kinds of stories to life through this collaborative process.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing your stories and for joining us this afternoon. I'm in awe of all of your talents, and I can't wait for the concert on Tuesday and to hear some more of your work. Thank you again, and hopefully we can see you all in person sometime in the future. Thank you so much. Thank you, guys.